Right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our series of chats with prominent people in the world of dentistry. Today, I'd like to introduce Chris Barrow. Chris, as many of you know, is regarded as the UK's leading dental business coach with an impressive track record in turning around dental businesses and creating growth strategies which ultimately lead to wealth creation. Chris's business, Extreme Business, has launched its 2023 program which will transform 100 practices next year. Chris is here today to share his insights, to give a view on past dentistry, present dentistry, and the dentistry of the future, how our profession is evolving, and what you might wish to think about for your future. Whether you're associate or principal, we're all traveling on a journey of self-development. So let's just take a few minutes to explore this. So please allow me to welcome Chris. Hello, Chris.
Julian, thank you for asking me on to this broadcast. It's a real privilege to be here, and it's a nice change to be on the other side of the relationship instead of being the interviewer, to be the interviewee for a change. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to come on. I know you're really busy. Okay, now to start with, I think we'll just kick off with what can you share with the audience before we get into all this about what you're doing now and what you've done, because I'm quite sure my introduction didn't quite do that justice.
Well, it's interesting nowadays. I've got to that stage in my career where every time I do a talk, the person who's introducing me says the next speaker needs no introduction. And so there's a huge assumption there, of course, which is that everybody does know who you are. If there is anybody out there who is thinking, who the hell is this guy? All you need to know is 26 years now of offering business consultancy advice almost exclusively to the dental sector. And quite frankly, Julian, a situation where my whole life revolves around dentistry. The best man at my wedding was one of my dental clients. My friends are dentists. I climb mountains with dentists. I ride bikes with dentists. In fact, during the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee, we had a street party here, and my wife had to introduce me to my own neighbours because I didn't really know who any of them were. But if I go along to a dental meeting, you know, whether it's a trade show or a conference, there are going to be people there that I've known for over 20 years and some even longer. So what have I been doing? I've been doing business development work with dental practices. My job is to look at financial systems, marketing systems, patient journey systems, leadership and management systems, help them to get the ship running as tightly as possible. And I do like to try to keep my eyes and ears open at the very, very, very innovative edge of the adoption cycle to see what's coming next in the world of dentistry, whether it's clinical or business, to keep an eye on what's coming down the track and to try and keep my clients at the front of that as well. And referencing what you said earlier on, I've launched a program I did back in 2022 called the Extreme Business 100. The idea was to work with 100 dental businesses on improvement, and that's because that's pretty much as I can tackle as a one-man band. And to my utter delight, in Q4 of 2021, that program filled up. And what's quite interesting at the moment is that I'm seeing about 10 or 15% churn on that client base, because there are some people who are selling their practices primarily to corporates, sometimes to individual purchasers. There are other people who are saying, Chris, we need to take a break from you for a year or two and just consolidate the stuff that we've learned from you. But it's running quite nicely. And we've just, you know, we're recording this around about the end of the year, and we've just seen the churn. There's a few people that have come through this month saying we're going to take a break. I've actually got probably about a dozen practices at the moment that are in some kind of deal flow with a corporate or an independent buyer. Probably get back to that in our interview. But the good news is that I've always got a steady stream of new people turning up and saying, I heard you speak at a conference 20 years ago. I've been reading your stuff ever since then. Or my mate says you're a good egg and I'd like you to come and keep me busy. So I'm delighted to say that I'm as busy as I've ever been.
Well, that's fabulous, and what a great introduction. I mean, that in itself is probably a 2 hour conversation with any dentist trying to think about how they improve their practice. Listen, before we get on to the now, right? I mean, what I'd be really interested, I'm sure, I say I hopefully I speak for the people who will be listening to this. Can you give us your view on the last 24 months, how that's shaped the dentistry that we are seeing today?
Yeah, I think it's a curate's egg, Julian. There's good and bad in it, and let's deal with the bad stuff. Let's get that out of the way. I have a personal philosophy, which is that every single one of us, you and I included, are suffering from a condition that I call PCSS, and that's post-COVID stress syndrome. We're all waiting for the new normal to happen, and it hasn't. And all that's happened since lockdown has been what is this month's crisis. And we can go back 2 years when we were all trying to find our way through furlough, or we were all trying to find our way through COVID, or we were all trying to find our way through whatever the crisis was. And of course, in the last 6 months, we're trying to find our way through cost of living. We're trying to find our way through labor costs going up. We're trying to find our way through all these bloody prime ministers and chancellors and budgets. And we're now trying to find our way through recession and through a winter of discontent, the like of which I've not seen since the good old days of the 1970s, when, strikers were striking pretty much every Christmas. And it's almost like we've gone back in time. So we're all dealing with the effects of all of these repeat crises. And I think that what that has created, perhaps in society, not just in dentistry, is a minority of people who are resilient. And I'm very fortunate and very blessed to be able to describe myself as one of the resilient people. Some of my friends have given me the nickname Mr. Weeble, because no matter how many times you knock me down, I just bounce back up again. And that's something I've always been able to do. And there are some of us who are Mr. Weebles and Mrs. Weebles, and there are some of us who are very resilient and able to deal with all of this change. There are many more who are not. And so that's why we're having a conversation about mental health issues in dentistry. That's why we're having a conversation about an exodus from the National Health Service. I know we're going to get back to that in this conversation, but we're also having a conversation about an exodus from ownership. That I've got more of my clients who are and more people contacting me and saying, Chris, we need to get out of this because it's driving us daft. And we want to polish the silver before we sell this on. And we'd like you to come in and make the practice as attractive an acquisition candidate as we possibly can, because we just want to jump ship. So I think it's probably an 80-20 rule, because these things normally are. And there's probably 20% of us who are resilient, who are called to leadership in a situation like that. And there's probably 80% of us who are not so resilient and who are looking for leadership. And I think dentistry is a microcosm of what we see out in society in the same sense. There's a hunger for leadership. There's a hunger for direction. There's a hunger to have somebody to rely on in order to make us feel safer in what is a very scary landscape. So that's my view of the last 24 months, is that the resilient people have risen to the top. That I think that it's easy to spot them. I think there are some very good leaders in dentistry now, people who've risen through COVID, they've risen through the events of the last 2 years, and they can be clearly identified as key opinion leaders. There's an awful lot of people there looking for that leadership. And I'll say one more thing about the last 24 months. And it's true about, I'm just about to enter my 7th recession since I started work full-time back in September 1970. And so I've got some experience of these things. And one of the things about crisis, one of the things about recession, is that it forces innovation. So what we've seen in the last 2 years is that digital workflow in dentistry has accelerated much faster than it would have done have we not had the circumstances? We've seen, rightly or wrongly, we're seeing a rapid change in labour costs within the dental market, because what I would argue to have been a weakness, a fault in the fact that I know we're going to talk about dental nurses, for example, as an example of that. Dental nurses' pay has been lousy in this country compared to other countries for decades. And what's happened is that this crisis period has accelerated that forward this year, and we're seeing a rapid change now. And so problems push innovation, because we need solutions. And in order to get solutions that work in a problematic landscape, we have to innovate. And so nobody's enjoyed COVID. Nobody's enjoyed the roller coaster the last 24 months. Nobody's enjoying what's going on right now. But the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the leaders know that this is a time of opportunity.
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, it's interesting. We'll come back to things like, wage inflation, the dynamics around Brexit, the challenges that practices face with all forms of recruitment within the dental practice now. You touched on the NHS, and so I'd just like to bring you back to that question. There appears to be a growing level of dissatisfaction. That's probably an understatement, isn't it? There appears to be. There is a palpable level of dissatisfaction within the NHS amongst the profession. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to preface my comments by saying two things. The first thing is that during COVID, I was stood outside my door at 8 o'clock every Thursday night, applauding our NHS along with everybody else. Now, of course, the NHS nurses that are on strike at the moment may have said that applause sounded very hollow once they've seen what's happened to them since then. But nonetheless, I was out there, and I was out there because I was proud of our NHS. The second thing I'm going to say, and I won't spend too long with this because most of the people that know me are sick of hearing about it, but I fell off my bike in August this year. I was quite seriously injured. I had a week in hospital, followed by a week at home, followed by another spell in hospital, having surgery. And in fact, I'm 5 months down the line now, and I'm still recovering from that cycling accident. And I can only offer praise for every single human being that I met on my own journey through the NHS system, part of which was having a collarbone replacement, part of which was having 7 broken ribs sorted out, part of which was dealing with respiratory issues as a result of it. I've been looked after like royalty, and it's been an incredible experience, and it's made me again very proud of our NHS system. I accept the delays. I've had 3 review appointments with my surgeon that have been cancelled at their end. It's taken them 5 months to get me into a physio program. In fact, I've just gone and paid for my own private physio. But nonetheless, I think these people are heroes. I preface, therefore, what I'm about to say, which is that when we look at NHS dentistry, it reminds me very much of that bit in the movie Titanic, where the vessel suddenly lifts upright and everybody runs to the top and hangs on for dear life. And unfortunately, the band that were playing Nearer My God to Thee on the deck when the vessel was simply listing have long gone into the frozen ocean, and we're all just clinging to the top of the vessel now and wondering what the bloody hell's going to happen next. It's pretty bleak. It's pretty bleak. And so, yes, of course, the plan providers are drowning in conversion work. And I have been very clear in my advice to the clients that I work with. You'll know this better than I do, Julian, but I know that in September of 2021, there was a meeting of the Association of Dental Groups at which it was shared that at that point in time, 70% of all NHS patients in the United Kingdom were being serviced by a dental corporate. Now that's September 21. I haven't heard the statistics since then, but the sure as apples didn't go down, the sure as apples went up. And so God only knows what percentage of NHS patients are now being serviced by dental corporates. And that's exactly the right solution, because it's those corporates, i.e. consolidators, who have got the economies of scale that are necessary to have even a rat's chance of making NHS dental contracts work. And the idea that an independent provider can compete in that marketplace with their own operating costs and their own variable costs is, in my view, next to ludicrous. So why are the plan providers busy? Because the smaller independent NHS contract provider has realised that they are clinging to the top of a Titanic. It's sinking fast. They do realise that what's actually happened is that all the survivors from the Titanic have buggered off to the boat next door called corporate dentistry. So there's nothing to be gained by clinging onto this sinking vessel. The sooner they get in a lifeboat, the better. And of course, what I'm encouraging them to do is to swim to swim or row in the other direction to the other boat that's called independent private dentistry, providing dental plans. And there's never been a moment in my 26 years when it's been better to do that, because number one, BBC, number two, ITV, number three, print media are doing the best job that we've ever seen of telling everybody that it's a dental desert out there, that you can't get access, that people are taking their own teeth out with pliers, that they're going to Turkey to come back looking like horses. It's never been better. It's never been a better time to convert. It's never been a better time to open a private squat, by the way. I've got clients who are doing that, and they're doing it incredibly successfully. So insofar as my client base are concerned, that's the owners of small businesses, it's goodbye NHS dentistry.
Well, that's incredibly clear. Thanks. Thanks for that, Chris. So I was recently told, and you've answered this, but I'm going to ask you the question because it was posed to me, the question, that the boom in private dentistry that we're seeing today is actually fueled primarily by the build-up of demand which has occurred over the last couple of years with COVID, with access, with difficulty for access, difficulty for clinics to be able to get through the numbers they once got through, in terms of how much time now has to be allocated to a patient. And I guess the question that was being posed next, is this real private demand? Is there a change out there in the population, particularly in a situation where you got fuel crisis, you got the shocker that's Russia and Ukraine, which don't start me on that one. You got all that stuff going on. Is the man in the street, the non-dentist, has their mindset changed? Are they more willing to pay for private dentistry? And here comes the final one, of course, Chris. You talk about the independence, but you will know only too well that there are dentists and then there are dentists.
Okay. I think that there are two issues that are going on simultaneously, and that it's important to separate them and not get them confused. All right. So I want to talk about the demand for long-term oral health. Let's call it preventative maintenance for the purpose of this conversation, because we've got a dental audience. All right. Let's talk about the long-term demand for preventative maintenance. And then as a separate issue, let's talk about the demand for personal self-confidence when either eating or smiling in public. All right. Now, I'm going to put that under a generic title, which we're going to call cosmetic dentistry. But can I explain that my definition of cosmetic dentistry starts with tooth whitening, but it finishes with a full mouth restoration? And the reason for that is because the purpose of that cosmetic dentistry is that somebody is confident when they're eating and smiling and speaking in public and in front of cameras. All right. So let's go back to market number one, preventative maintenance. You're absolutely right that there is a short-term hike in the demand for private preventative maintenance, which is being created by the lack of access to NHS preventative maintenance. When the floodgates open to overseas dental care professionals, when the floodgates open to overseas dentists, that demand for preventative maintenance will be assuaged by the fact that there's going to be hundreds, not even hundreds, there are going to be thousands of dental care professionals who will enter the United Kingdom from overseas, and they will be happy to work within whatever NHS system is available to them. In other words, we will go back to the noughties. We will go back to the days, frankly, Julian, when you were involved in corporate dentistry, and when that provision, now, of course, your particular corporate was mixed, whereas I go back to 2008, 2010, when I spent a couple of years working at IDH as it was then, which was 90-10 NHS private. And of course, IDH in those days was fueled by overseas dentists. And then they all went home after Brexit. Your business at that time was more mixed, but nonetheless, you were involved in that market. And there's an economy of scale involved in bringing in overseas labour, which allows you to run an NHS contract at a profitable basis. Certainly profitable enough to keep your investors happy if you're a corporate. So that'll come back. So private preventative maintenance is going to take a hit when those overseas doors reopen. And in fact, it creates an urgency, it creates a window of opportunity to get patients into an independent plan, because they'll be less likely to leave that plan when they've got used to it. We saw during COVID the level of plan loyalty that was maintained through lockdown. So once you can get people signed into that plan philosophy and into those plan payments, you're less likely to see them drift back into the provision of NHS, but some will go. So on point one, I agree. Let's now talk about point two, which was my definition of cosmetic dentistry. It's always there. It always will be there. And it will always be there because there are always going to be recession-proof demographics. And recession-proof demographics, sweeping generalization coming up, recession-proof demographics are largely people who are not raising families. In other words, they're either pre-kid or post-kid in the sense that they're in empty nest syndrome. And the best demographic of all is mine. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1953, right in the middle of the demographic. I'm 69 years old. My dad was dead when he was 72. My grandfather was dead when he was the same age as me. I'm going to live for another 25 years. I'm going to ride my bike. I'm going to climb mountains. I'm going to look good. I'm going to feel good. And I've got more disposable income than those two previous generations as well. So there's plenty of me who want to look good and feel good. There's plenty of me who want to be able to eat and smile in public in front of cameras. And we're going to get divorced and remarried. We're going to retire. We're going to see our kids get married. We're going to go to graduation and coming of age ceremonies. There's going to be loads of reasons for us to look good and feel good. So that's a fantastic market. Even us baby boomers just born in that 10-year period, we've got 45% of all the net disposable income and capital in the UK. And there's no bloody way we're going to see an NHS dentist to have our needs met.
Well, great answer. Love that. That was a very good, you broke that down into two very clear pots, which was incredibly helpful. So a statement, I think it's a general statement I'm going to make, again, need your view. Working practice appears to have changed post-COVID, with a substantial number of associates now wanting to work part-time as opposed to full-time. What do you think about this, and where do you think that will take dentistry in terms of access and care provision?
Yeah, great point. Certainly, even within my client base, there's hardly a week goes by that I'm not in communication with somebody who tells me that either their hygienist or their therapist or their associate has decided to work less days. And I think that is just a microcosm of what's going on in society, because COVID made us rethink our work-life balance. COVID made us rethink our core values. And so even before the delivery of dentistry became more problematic in the current era, whether it was cross-infection control, whether it was masking, whether it was distancing, whether it was flexible working hours, whatever it was, it all got a bit tougher after lockdown. And I'm back to my 80-20 rule, Julian, which is that 20% of dentists just suck it up and get on with it. And 80% of dentists are saying, oh, my God, I'm going to drop a day a week because it's too hard. And so there's a lot of that going on. The question remains, and I think, by the way, it's arguably slightly more of a problem in dentistry than it is perhaps working in other business sectors, because actually delivering dentistry in the post-pandemic environment has actually been a tough call. It's been a difficult thing to do. So I've got great sympathy for those people. So it begs the question, is this renewed interest in work-life balance, is this renewed interest in taking time off to smell the roses or walk the dog or ride the horse or write the book, is that going to last? And, I've been out on the workshop road again this year. I've just completed a year in which I've delivered 56 client workshops all over the United Kingdom. And what I've noticed as I travel around is that in terms of traffic in cities and on motorways, in terms of users of public transport, in terms of the busyness of, I deliver workshops in London, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Edinburgh, Belfast. And occasionally I get to travel to other places to do guest stuff. And what I've noticed over this year, Julian, is that slowly but surely the world seems to be getting back to its pre-COVID busyness. And I've been sat in a few traffic jams recently thinking, holy crap, I've not seen this since before COVID. So I wonder, now, I think the one thing I will say is that it's not unusual now to see people in offices that are having work at home days. And that, of course, wasn't a phenomenon pre-COVID. And I think that there are some interesting conversations about how long that's going to last in corporate UK. What are the economics of having an office block that's empty all day Friday? And I don't even know the answers to those questions. It's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. But insofar as dentistry is concerned, what you've got on one hand is this renewed interest in quality of life. And what we've now got on the other hand is mortgage interest rates going up, cost of living going up, energy prices going up. And does there come a point in time when somebody says, I'm going to give up my pottery class because I need to get back to work because I need the bloody money?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that is.
So where's it going to take us in terms of access? Well, the markets self-regulate, don't they, Julian? And, where there's a demand for labour, the labour emerges. So yeah. I think I've got a sneaking suspicion we're all going to be running around with our bloody hair on fire again within 12 months, doing everything that we used to do before COVID. And I think we'll have forgotten COVID.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess on that basis, we talk about, we haven't really talked about it, but everyone's aware of Brexit, cost of living crisis, dental nurse, wage inflation, difficulty to get associates. We sit in a world in the UK where associates are paid somewhere between 45 and 50%. In the short term, do you see that dynamic changing?
In the short term, we've got a labour shortage, and so the law of supply and demand says that wages have got to go back up again. The NHS corporates, of course, did a magnificent job of camouflaging associate wages inside the UDA system, and so that turned principals and corporates into wholesalers, and it turned associates into retailers, and who didn't know what the margin was. So that was very handy for people like you at the time. There's of course, we still have a UDA system at the time of recording this interview, and so that kind of camouflaging is still possible. But generally speaking, of course, we're seeing the UDA rates being paid to associates climb this year. So it's just the cost of labour. And so all that we can really say about that is that let's wait for the floodgates to open. Because, when the General Dental Council announced that the ORE has been changed, when the entry requirements change, when the floodgates open, then the law of supply and demand says cost of labour goes back down again. So all that we're doing at the moment is we're just witnessing an economic cycle that we've not seen really since the introduction of the UDA contracts all those years ago.
So, Chris, earlier in this conversation, you said that you are a technology enthusiast, and on the basis of that, the way I see it at the moment, we're seeing slow adoption of technology in the UK, like intraoral cameras, like digital laboratory workflows, compared to many other countries. Why do you think that is?
I think it exists because in British dentistry, if you look at that adoption cycle that goes from innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggards, during my 26 years full-time in dentistry, what I've realised is that there's an awful lot of British dentists that are quite happy to sit in the late majority laggard end of the adoption cycle, partly because of the NHS system, partly to some extent because of British cultural norms. It was easy to make a nice living being a family dental practice, doing NHS dentistry, or if you were feeling a bit giddy, you brought den planning in the early 90s and you converted over to private, and then you carried on supervising that client base until it was time for retire. So here's what I'm going to say. I arrived in dentistry part-time in 1987. I arrived in dentistry full-time in 1997. And it was an easy life. And it carried on being an easy life for a very, very long time. And it's only really in recent years that it's become a harder life, and that therefore it's been necessary for some dentists to kind of travel around the adoption cycle towards early majority, towards early adopter, and maybe even towards innovator in order to try and figure out what was next and stay ahead of the competition. But even now, you're absolutely right, Julian, that I'm going to do an 80-15-5 rule, which is that 5% of British dentists are in the innovation cycle, part of the cycle, and probably 15% of them, even post-COVID, only 15% of them are in the early adoption, early majority cycle. And there's still 80% of them sat there in late majority and laggard going, don't change a thing. We've always done this on a Tuesday. It's always worked. Let's just keep on doing it. Now, I've been very fortunate over the last 2.5 years. I've been able to host a European webinar series for Align Technology on the use of intraoral scanning. And I've been able to host speakers from all over Europe, and in fact, 1 or 2 from further afield as well. We've been getting 6,000 people on those webinars every year from all over Europe who are keen to learn. And a small proportion of them are there from Britain. And a lot of the people that are there from Britain are there because I've messaged them and I've said, I'm hosting this webinar. You should get on it because here we've got people who are cutting edge. So to summarize, and I'll get shot for saying this, it's been too easy for too long to make a good living by being ordinary. So we've ended up in Britain with an ordinary dental community. And it's COVID, Brexit and COVID that have been the triggers to push people away from ordinary and towards extraordinary. But there's still a long way to go.
Well, I don't think, I can't imagine that many people will shoot you. They might not like what you said, but then, we very seldom like things that are told to us that we don't want to hear, even though they might be right. So that leads me on to we're gonna wrap up in a few minutes because we like to keep these within a sort of a timely fashion.
Yeah.
So whether around the topic that you were just talking about or any other really, if you had to thought provoke, nudge, give a dentist a little shake in this post-COVID period, what would that advice look like?
Do you know that's arguably the easiest thing you're going to ask me today because I'm going to give the answer to that question is going to be the advice that I find myself giving my clients pretty much every day, and it's 2 points. Okay, point number one: you're only ever going to be as good as the management team that you build around you, because you can't do it all yourself. And point number two: you're only ever going to be as good as the extent to which you're prepared to innovate. And that's it.
Yeah. Well, I suppose when you look at both of those points, that makes perfect sense. Okay, on the flip side, because you've lots of experience there, what are the main reasons that dentists hold back? What's that break that stops them understanding and moving forward? That suddenly what stops them seeing that sort of light bulb moment?
Well, one of my favourite phrases is that the word fear, FEAR, is actually a mnemonic because it stands for fantasy expressed as reality. Mm-hmm. And what people do when they are fearful is that they fantasize. So I, for example, am petrified of heights. I'm scared of heights. And I've never actually fallen off anything other than a bike. But the reality of the situation is that throughout my life, when I've been on a cliff edge, when I've been on a bridge, when I've been on the top of a tall building, I've fantasized about falling off it, even though I never have. So I'm fearful. So my legs go to jelly. So earlier this year, I was invited with a group of friends to attempt to climb Mont Blanc in Italy. In what we're talking about in France, sorry, Mont Blanc in France. And I rather foolishly said yes, and then realized that actually Mont Blanc was a mountain and that I was capable of falling off it. So I ended up having about 6 months of cognitive behavioral therapy with a therapist who gave me some techniques to deal with that fear. Now, it's a bit of a long story short. In the event we were unable to climb Mont Blanc because the mountain was closed due to climate change, is closed. But we did successfully climb the highest mountain in Italy. It's called Gran Paradiso. It's a long way up. And the scariest bit, just after you've hit the summit, is to have to sideways shimmy along a ledge, which is just wide enough for the ball of your foot. And it's a 3,000 foot drop straight down behind. And I did manage to climb Gran Paradiso, and I did manage to shimmy across. The ledge is called the Crux, CRUX. It's very famous. So I did manage to shimmy along the Crux and get myself back down off the mountain. Now, I need you to know my boots are on eBay because I'm not doing it again. But I've got the tick. And it was an interesting metaphor because I had the fear and I got the therapy, which allowed me to develop systems to deal with the fear. And as a result of that, I was able to face the challenge and I was able to deal with it. So let's go back to your question. What holds dentists back? They don't face the fear and they're frightened. They're scared to death of losing patients. They're scared to death of leaving the NHS. They're scared to death of upsetting the staff. They're scared to death of losing hygiene therapists or associates if they say the wrong thing. And there's too many dentists. They're scared to death, of course, of litigation now. And they're scared to death of the GDC because of the environment that's been created by the General Dental Council over the last 20 years. They're scared to death of investing in the business. They're scared to death of technology and innovation. So the overwhelming majority of dentists are just scaredy cats. And they've been beaten sometimes by the regulators into that attitude of mind. And it's very, very difficult to get them to break through it. And of course, one of the things that people like us end up doing for a living is the therapy that's involved in saying, let's quantify that fear, let's face that fear, let's come up with some systems and techniques to deal with that fear, and then let's do it. And they're the people that break through to the next level. But there are not enough therapists and too many scared dentists at the moment.
I think they're very wise words, actually. Chris, that about brings us to the end of this. I mean, that just flew by. So thank you very much. I think on that note, I'm going to bring this audience with Chris to a close. If you want to get in touch with Chris or have a chat with Chris, I think this is okay, isn't it, Chris? You can be contacted via the team at philippa@coachbarrow.com. That's PHILLIPPA at coachbarrow.com. Chris, it's been great. Thank you so much for your insights. Very valuable. I hope everyone who gets the opportunity to this listens to all of it and shares it with their friends. Wish you every happiness.
You too, Julian. To listeners and to you, hope you're looking forward to 23 as much as I am. See you over there.
Bye, Chris. Thanks very much.